Hey guys, I'm Ben and welcome to another episode of Albums Ranked. Today we're going for a trip to the underground once again, this time to have a look at the German cult legends Lucifer's Friend. Lucifer's Friend are kind of a strange case in many ways. They're a band that have been very influential to many much more well-known bands and have even helped create and define several musical genres, namely heavy metal, at least at the proto-metal stage, along with, of course, the mainstays Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, and Uriah Heep, among others. They also helped grow the progressive rock and jazz fusion scene as well, and have even been said to have been progenitors of doom metal. Yet despite all of this, they never managed to enjoy the success of their peers. Of course, all of this makes defining Lucifer's Friend a difficult task. They cannot easily fit into any particular genre box, and that was clearly demonstrated by the fact that they seem to change styles with each album. The band never managed to have any commercial success and remained an underappreciated force in music throughout their entire career. Obviously, the genre hopping is an easy explanation for that, perhaps, but combine that with the fact that they were a German band with an English singer at a time in the birth of metal when the scene was primarily coming out of England. So they didn't quite catch on. But I also think that their name must have been a factor too. I can imagine radio stations and record labels perhaps being hesitant to promote a band that might bring them unwanted controversy around the name. Lucifer's Friend actually began their life under the band name of Asterix. John Lawton had just left his band Stonewall while on tour in Germany in 1969 and soon met up with the members of the German band called the German Bonds, including guitarist Peter Hesslein, bassmaster Dieter Horns, keyboardist Peter Hecht, and drummer Joachim Reitenbach. They quickly found they had a great musical connection with the English singer, and by 1970 they released the fantastic self-titled album Asterix. Essentially, this is the first Lucifer's Friend album, and so I will include it in the ranking. That same year, however, they would change their name and release the official debut album, this time as Lucifer's Friend, and once again it was self-titled. Anyway, the band would produce several albums until 1976, when John Lawton would step away to join British legends Uriah Heep for several albums. During this period, the band would continue on for 2 more albums after recruiting Mike Starrs from the prog fusion band Colosseum 2. Eventually, however, John Lawton would return to the fold and several more albums would follow, spread over quite a number of years. In 1994, after a long period of the band being essentially defunct, John would reunite with Peter Hesslein and several other alternative members to release the album Sumo Grip under the name Lucifer's Friend 2. I will also include that album here in the ranking because I think it deserves to be included. Anyway, sadly, Dieter Horns died in 2020 and John Lawton followed him in 2021, which categorically ended the band. They had made somewhat of a comeback in recent years, so it was a sad loss just when the band was starting to get some credit and love again. Anyway, I actually find this a very hard catalogue to rank because the fact that the albums are all quite different, and even though there are some attributes that seem to remain throughout their career, they are always presented slightly differently and many times in a way that's a total game changer. This, of course, makes it hard to compare them in a meaningful way. For example, how do you compare a proto-metal album to a jazz fusion prog album? They're worlds apart. yet equally awesome in their own way. So you got to take my list with a grain of salt. For me, the order changes all the time, and that includes the ones right at the top. This video is more about me just showing some love to a band that I personally love and feel doesn't get enough love and respect for the fantastic and groundbreaking music they made. Anyway, so let's get into it. Starting at the bottom in the 12th spot, we have 1994's Sumo Grip. So this was a reconstituted version of the band built around the only two original members in John Lawton and Peter Hesselheim. They would recruit new players to fill out the band, and while there are some cool moments on this album, and it certainly got its charm, it is also very dated sounding and at times just too damn schmaltzy and cheesy. It has that late 80s, early 90s modern sound to it that really reminds me of the sort of shitty movie soundtracks of that time. Like, imagine movies like, the live action Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or Tango and Cash. Just remember those movies having these terrible soundtracks. And at times it sounds a bit like that here at the worst points. But however, when it's good, it reminds me more of, let's say, like Deep Purple's Perfect Strangers and that kind of vibe. And songs like Heartbreaker and One Way Ticket to Hell are standouts and worth checking out. However, even though the performances are strong and John Lawton sounds fantastic as always, the album just feels less inspired than the usual fare. They were very much, playing it safe on this one, and I think they largely missed the mark. That being said, however, I still think if you're in the mood for more straight-ahead AOR, then this can still be a fun listen. However, it's probably my least favorite, and I think even the next two albums on this list, which are their most commercial sounding, actually had more interesting music contained within than Sumo Grip. A decent album, but a flawed album. Next in the 11th spot, we have 1978's Good Time Warrior. This was the point where Mike Starrs came across from Colosseum 2 to replace the exiting John Lawton. This album would see the band try for more commercial fare, leaning more into a radio-friendly AOR kind of thing. Certainly not terrible, but lacking the fire and interest of the preceding albums. Mike Starrs does a fine job, and the guy was a pretty good choice for that music, but unfortunately too much interest in the band had waned by that stage, and they weren't able to have any real breakout success with this or the follow-up album with this lineup. I get a strong kind of Elton John vibe with this album. So, if a slightly more rocked up version of Elton sounds like your jam, then go check it out. As I said, it's not terrible, and in fact, it's actually pretty good for what it is. It just doesn't really grab me like the John Lawton albums. The song Warriors is a cool highlight with its 10-minute runtime. It's pretty much like a prog Elton John, and it's pretty great, actually. So check it out. Next in the 10th spot, and probably, won't surprise anyone, but it's the follow-up album, 1980's Sneak Me In. Again, the style is largely the same as the previous album, aimed at a more commercial market. However, sadly for the band, again, failing to make any real significant waves. That being said, both this and Good Time Warriors have plenty of songs that I think could easily have been hits, but for, whatever reason, I think they just didn't catch on. Again, I really believe it has, it was all about the band name. It was just too much for the more conservative-minded radio stations at the time, I think. Again, the band plays very well throughout the album, and Mike Starrs does a commendable job on the microphone, but it wasn't enough, and in the end, the album went nowhere. I very rarely listen to these two albums, but if you're a fan of the band and don't mind the AOR end of hard rock, then they're worth checking out, because even though the material is what it is, the band is still a great pro band of serious musical talent. So they make it more interesting than a lot of other commercial fare from that time. Coming into the ninth place, we're gonna take a big leap forward to the band's final album, 2019's Black Moon. So after a long period of inactivity after 1994's Sumo group, the original band would mostly reform with the inclusion of a new keyboardist and drummer in tow around 2014, and would release two final studio albums, Black Moon being the second and final of this run. And really, this is just a great, high-quality classic rock album. John Lawton, who really is one of the great vocalists, still sounded fantastic, and the band of consummate pros just sounded killer too. These last two albums both kind of remind me of the latter era Uriah Heep output, which is probably only slightly less ignored, to be honest, than this stuff, but is great. However, while there are many times when Uriah Heep and Lucifer's Friend share common ground, I think that Lucifer's Friend, their music is always on another level of orchestration and complexity that takes the classic hard rock to another level. That's one of the defining aspects of this band, and even when they were doing their most commercial stuff in the Mike Starrs era, they never stopped throwing in interesting and cool changes and passages to keep the real music fans interested. Anyway, Black Moon is a great album, and I would definitely recommend giving it a spin. Next, in the 8th position, we have the album that preceded Black Moon, 2016's Too Late to Hate.
Sometimes I'm on the run behind that smoking gun, and they will never know the shame. You'll feel that stranger's arm cling to that deadly charm. Those eyes can play the waiting game. Tonight I'm on my way. The light will fade to gray. The future lies within your head.
So this was a very pleasant return when this album dropped, and it was great to hear these veterans return with so much energy and a great set of songs. The album, to my ears, feels very much like a companion piece to Black Moon, and the general sound and approach is very similar. I think it might just edge it out with the heaviness factor, which was a welcome return for the band that had sort of come in and out of heavy metal over the years. Again, the late era Uriah Heep vibe is strong with this one, and anyone who loves that classic sound of distorted guitars and Hammond organs and keys with soaring rock vocals delivered by one of the best in the game to ever do it, then this album is sure to please. The reason these two albums are lower on the list is because even though I really enjoy them, they aren't innovative like their earlier music. And for a band that was so innovative early in their career, it's a major factor that sets them apart from their contemporaries. Next, in the 7th spot, I've got 1981's Mean Machine. This was the album that saw the band reunite with John Lawton after his departure from Uriah Heep. Mean Machine would see the band return to a more metallic approach. However, this time, unlike their proto-metal debut, they would lean more into the speed metal and new wave of British heavy metal sound that was the dominant force at the time. With more straight-ahead riffing and rhythmic attack, this was a somewhat streamlined version of the band. However, the songwriting ability and performance was no less compelling. And honestly, when you hear similar artists that were charting with this type of material at the time, it's really hard to understand why Lucifer's Friend weren't part of that success. Their material was just as strong, and they can really play their asses off, better than many bands that did better than them. Again, I really think it's the name that held them back. I often wonder if they'd stuck with the name Asterix, if they would have had more success. Yeah, this is still, more on the accessible end of the metal spectrum, but they could easily have fit in with other new wave of British heavy metal bands like early Def Leppard and Praying Mantis, for example. Occasionally, they will sneak in little remnants of their progressive rock history, but they're disguised in bridge sections and quick instrumental turnarounds between the riffing for the most part. It even has a bit of a Judas Priest point of entry vibe at times. It's interesting that just previous to the making of this album, John Lawton had done a 3-album stint with Uriah Heep, and at a time when their music was getting lighter and poppier. Many David Byron fans blamed this on John Lawton, but this was utterly untrue. He was always game for heavier material. They just weren't giving him heavy songs to sing over. John Lawton is a real powerhouse vocalist and has a terrific sounding voice and incredible versatility. So it just proves the theory so wrong about it being his fault about Uriah Heep sounding softer when you can hear his return to Lucifer's Friend and the metal they unleashed with Mean Machine. A strong album, but personally, the thing I love about this band is their wild eccentricities, and that's why the albums to follow on this list mean more to me. Still highly recommended for fans of that early 80s scene. Moving forward from this point, I find it ranking the rest virtually impossible because I really love them all, and when I'm listening to each of these next albums in the moment, that is my favorite Lucifer's Friend album. But I'm making a ranking, so just for today's purposes, I'll place them. However, just know for me, it's really not set in stone. So with that being said, I'll put in the 6th place, 1976's Mind Exploding. Damn, it's hard to put this album this low on the list because it really is fantastic. On Mind Exploding, the band seemed to be fusing the two styles they had developed on their previous albums, Banquet and I'm Just a Rock and Roll Singer. More specifically, the direct hard rocking and boogie rocking of Rock and Roll Singer with elements of the prog jazz fusion explored on Banquet. At times it feels like they are touching on a sort of similar sound as American prog legends Kansas in their orchestration and harmony, while also having the driving rhythmic attack of early Rush. Dieter Horns on the bass is a major factor for that, and he is one of my favorite rock bass players for sure. Definitely up there with Geddy Lee in terms of creative expression and skill. The guy can really play any style perfectly. But, that can also be said for all the original guys in the band. Really a stellar bunch of pro musicians who not only had the studio chops, but were extremely creative and inventive. They managed to achieve this too with an almost always accessible framework with extremely catchy and listenable music. Mind Exploding is a great example of this, and I've noticed it gets somewhat overlooked, but I highly recommend it. Yes, it's not a metal album, so don't expect it to be, but it's fantastic hard rock and prog. Awesome stuff. Next, in the 5th spot is 1973's I'm Just a Rock and Roll Singer. So here, the band made a shift away from the doomier heaviness and progginess of the previous albums and went for a more direct, hard-rocking, hard boogie kind of approach. For some reason, this album always reminded me of Jeff Beck's Beck Ola album and that kind of vibe. And that's fine with me because I love Jeff Beck. The songs are killer, and it's just such a fun album. I absolutely love it. Again, the band handles the material like the absolute pros they were, and while it's not the most innovative album, the songs just have such a cool, badass swagger to them that it has always had a warm place in my heart. As I mentioned earlier about other albums, even when they're going more straightforward down the middle, the band will throw in little reminders of their creative skill with ornate bridge sections and interesting vocal harmony arrangements or rhythmic shifts that are sometimes overt, but many times subtle, but no less cool. And it really makes the song, especially if you're a musician, you really get off on listening to that kind of stuff. Songs like the infectious opener Groovin' Stone and follow-up tune Closed Curtains demonstrate this subtlety perfectly. Closed Curtain especially seamlessly covers a fair amount of ground without being obnoxious about it at all. Also, this album really highlights John's immense vocal talents because he's all over this bad boy, and he really has to be one of, if not the most underappreciated vocalist from the 70s. He really should be in the conversation with the Gillans, the Coverdales, and the Plants. He's that good, in my opinion. Next, in the 4th place, we have 1970s Asterix. Now, this is where it all began for the band. Technically, the next album was their debut under their famous moniker. However, this is the same band, and even though they were called Asterix at this time, the music is totally proto-metal, hard rock, krautrock that characterized the band in the beginning. Asterix, the album, is a fantastic album of hard rocking, riffing, driving rhythms, and cutting edge heaviness. Listen to the opening riff of Gone From My Life. It's just totally metal. Like Geezer Butler was doing at the same time with Black Sabbath's bass lines, i.e. making them unique and interesting and a major part of the music, so too was Dieter Horns and his fantastic lines. Of course, they did have the excellent piano playing of Peter Hecht, so that does give it a slightly more rock feel than Sabbath at times, but Peter Hessline's riffs and Joachim Reidenbach's drumming are just as fierce at times as their British contemporaries. This album also seems to get overlooked by many fans, but if you're one of the Lucifer's fans who only really knows or likes their first album and its more sort of metal approach, then you need to check out Asterix because it's from the same year, it's the same band, and just as heavy and cool. Highly recommended. Definitely check it out. Okay, the top three are bloody impossible, but I'm going to go with how I feel about it today. This does and will change probably even by the time I finish editing this video, but let's just go with it. I'm going to put in third place today most people's favorite, and that is 1970's official debut, Lucifer's Friend. I could understand you putting this at number one simply for the amazing opening track Ride the Sky alone, which is definitely one of the earliest pure metal tracks, and between John's fantastic vocal performance and the band's killer playing and composition, it's truly one of the great heavy metal songs from that era and still kills to this day. However, the album doesn't stop being awesome there. Here, the band explores more of the krautrock meets metal they were doing on Asterix, but with a doomier element added to the proceedings at times in songs like Keep Going and the title track, for example. But the album is full of great tracks like Baby You're a Liar and Toxic Shadows. Awesome stuff. But, if you're watching this video, then it's likely because you are a fan of this particular album. So I probably don't need to say too much about it. For fans of Sabbath-era proto-metal, this album is a must-have, and many days it is my favorite. Most metalheads gravitate to this album in particular, and I totally understand why. However, if you have more broad tastes like I do, then you might find the next two albums on the list equally compelling. So, with that being said, coming into the second spot, we have 1974's awesome Banquet.
The prisoner's hard luck story, with the pain of an empty cry, with the lights of a faraway town full, drifting away, drifting away. You and your dreams in a world of fantasy. Turn around, chime the bells. In a world of silver fire, Ron said the wind, and the words he sadly spoke. You can lean on me right at the and the whipping willow cried at the break.
This is probably the biggest outlier in the band's catalogue. Here, the band really reached far beyond the hard rock world, even past the prog rock world, and harnessed their jazz fusion chops. Now, often in this time period, prog bands were crossing this threshold between the two worlds. However, on Banquet, I think Lucifer's Friend did it possibly the most successfully and seamlessly, at least one of the most. The absolute standout and one of my favorite songs from this band is the opening track, Spanish Galleon. The sheer audacity and confidence that they showed approaching this style was so unexpected, but so compelling and convincing that if I was going to make a list of the greatest jazz rock fusion tracks, this would definitely be in the mix. Not a small feat for a band that only a couple of years earlier was helping create heavy metal out of the ether. The album employs strings and horns, and it's all orchestrated beautifully. And John Lawton, fucking John Lawton, man. On this song, Spanish Galleon, he sounds incredible, and his melodies are so infectious. I've got to have one of those in every fucking video I do, a tongue-tied moment. I would say if you have any love for jazz rock, then definitely check it out. The band is absolutely cooking on that track. It's on fire. When they get going and just unleash, it's jazz fusion heaven. The rest of the album is no slouch either, and the next song in particular is also a favorite, the remarkable Thus Spoke Oberon, another wonderful melody-filled powerhouse of composition and performance. The other long piece on the album, Sorrow, is also very cool, with somewhat of an early kind of Chicago vibe to it. But really for me, it's all about the first two songs, and they alone make this album often my personal favorite. I highly recommend this one to the more broad-minded among you, especially if you are a jazz fusion fan. But don't worry, there's still plenty of hard rock in there too. So that brings me finally to number one, and for today, it has to be 1972's Where the Groupies Killed the Blues. Well, the unusual album title will probably give you some clue that this is an unusual album. This may be the band at their most prog rock experimentalism. This album might also be responsible for killing their momentum. Likely fans of the emerging new form of heavy metal and hard rock that was so well expressed on their previous two albums were likely caught off guard when they first played this album. Mixing the heaviness this time with dark, moody piano passages and sudden rhythmic shifts, finding instead of a proto-metal band now very much a prog rock band that could easily share a stage with more forward-thinking and unusual bands like Gentle Giant. The album opens with the hard-rocking but slightly bizarre Hobo, which absolutely kills. I love that track. But then moves into the more gloomy and unexpected piano of Rose on the Vine. Then the total prog mastery of Mother, which even includes some mellotron for the final stamp of prog authenticity. Of course, the melody is dark yet beautiful and captivating. A fantastic track and another personal highlight from the album. The title track really sounds like it could be a Gentle Giant track too. It's in that ballpark anyway. John Lawton is a better singer than anyone in Gentle Giant, but those guys were masters of vocal harmonies, so I guess that's the trade-off in this particular comparison. Anyway, just another engaging and interesting journey into the prog experimentalism that, frankly, I wish they'd continued with. Prince of Darkness is next, and it opens with a reminder of their riff-writing skills, but rhythmically, it's very quickly much more than your average rock or metal track from that time. They not only managed to push the boundaries of that time throughout the album, but they managed to do it with a beauty and epic power that only the best of the genre were able to pull off. The amazing thing about Lucifer's Friend is that no matter which direction they took, the music on this album and throughout the rest of their career, they always sounded totally confident and capable of pulling it off. at a totally awesome and pro level too. Delirium, which follows, takes its cues from the Italian prog sound of grandiosity and pomp, at least to my ears, and it's absolutely glorious stuff. At times understated, and at others overtly out there. The compositional chops are on full display on this album, and you really almost get the sense that the band had been holding it all back previously, and they just needed to show the world what they could really do. And here they really did that. Finally, the album concludes with the lovely pastoral and proggy No Reason or Rhyme. Where the Groupies Killed the Blues is a unique album both in Lucifer's Friends catalogue but also in rock music in general. While it's clearly a prog rock album, it stands very much on its own merits and isn't derivative or predictable. An absolutely killer, dynamic and powerful album that deserves much more attention than it gets. So Lucifer's Friend are a band that defies boundaries or expectations, and unfortunately in their case, this may be the reason for the perpetual obscurity. As I've said multiple times though, I personally believe that you can trace a lot of their lack of success to the name. It was just too much. The 70s was overflowing with experimental and thought-provoking music that was challenging and diverse. So I really don't believe that their diverse musicality was the source of the problem. That being said though, I'm just speculating. I could easily be wrong about that. Either way, a fantastically talented and creative band that was the epitome of being a chameleon and that really deserves to be remembered for their important role in the development of multiple genres, as well as their large body of just damn good tunes. Anyway, guys, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Stay metal and see you next time.